Shalom. You know, one of the most important, beautiful concepts about the Torah experience, the Jewish experience, is the idea of community. Serving Hashem and growing spiritually, you can't be alone. You have to be attached to the community. One has to have a teacher to receive from. And all of us, every single person, also has people that we influence. And this idea of connection is very beautifully emphasized by a custom that some have before performing any of the mitzvot, before performing any of the commandments of the Torah. There's a statement that we make that we are doing this commandment in the name of all of Israel, and kind of nullifying ourselves to the klal, to the community at large, and becoming just part of that body of Israel, which of course has merit in its own right. It's the eternal body of Israel that we're part of, and by connecting ourselves to the whole body of Israel, everything takes on the proper perspective, and we're not doing something alone. We're part of the greater whole. This week, we are reading Parashat Acharei-Mot, beginning in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 16. After we kind of took a break in the Parshiot of Tazria and Mitzorah, now the Torah returns to the subject of the death of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, that we read about in Parashat Shmini. And we read here in the Torah, in the beginning of the portion this week, that Hashem spoke to Moshe after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they came near before Hashem and died. And Hashem said to Moshe, "Speak to Aaron your brother that he does not come at all times into the holy place within the veil before the covering, which is upon the ark, that he should not die, for I appear in the cloud upon the ark cover. But rather, thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bullock for a sin offering, etc." And this is a reference to Yom Kippur. So basically, instructions are being given for how Aaron should come into the holy place. And the impression certainly that we have, and Rashi tells us also, is that in order for this not to happen again, in other words, in order to avoid what happened to Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, that they should not die in that manner, this is the prescribed method for entering into the holy place. However, this gives us pause. We have certain questions because of this, because after all, the verse specifically tells us that they brought a strange fire before Hashem. That was back in Parashat Shmini. And if they brought a strange fire before Hashem, so what are these instructions exactly relating to? What does this have to do with what happened then? Furthermore, as we learned at that time, our sages tell us certain kind of hints about the nature, spiritually, of what that sin was, that strange fire. And they tell us things that are really kind of like a code. And we emphasize that because, after all, Nadav and Avihu were quite righteous. They were great tzaddikim. They wanted to be as close to Hashem as possible. And our sages tell us, for example, that one aspect of their sinfulness was that they actually had the audacity to render a decision, a halachic decision, in the presence of Moshe, their master. They answered while he was standing there. Of course, this is considered to be a very bad attribute for a student to speak out without his master's presence. In his presence, they answered a halachic question. And another thing our sages tell us very cryptically is that, well, they were not married and they did not have children. And of course, these things are somehow, as we mentioned, a code for some deeper spiritual flaw, having nothing to do, of course, with the fact that their motivation was very high and pure, and they were actually very righteous. But somehow this fits into the concept of the strange fire that they brought before Hashem, and yet we are told in the beginning of this week's Parsha, Acharei-Mot, that this is how Aaron should come to the holy place, a reference to his entering into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And actually there's a very great secret that is being referred to here, this concept of, as we mentioned, the inclusion of every Jew in the community of Israel, and the nullification, as it were, to the greater whole. The fact that everything that we do, we are really doing together as a unit, as a community, and how important that is for spiritual progress. And the concept really is that even the Kohen Gadol, even the high priest, when he enters into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, he only does that as a manifestation of his attachment to all of Israel. He does that in the name of all of Israel, and thus, actually, he is empowered by the merit of Israel, who on that day, the day of Yom Kippur, they are likened to the ministering angels. There is a tremendous spirit of atonement that washes over Israel and the world, and because of the high spiritual stature of the Jewish people on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is enabled to actually go into the presence of the Shekhinah in the Holy of Holies, and actually it is a manifestation of his connection, his inexorable bond with the entire community of Israel, because were he to go in on his own, even if he would be on a great and high level, even if he would be higher than the entire community of Israel, it would not work. It's only when he is attached to the community in general. And this actually is a deep insight into what really transpired regarding the death of Nadav and Avihu, because in fact they were actually on a very high level. And perhaps spiritually they did not nullify themselves to their Rav, to the Tzaddik, to the righteous Moshe. They felt perhaps that they were on a level that they did not need to receive. And this is really the symbolism of the criticism of our sages, that they, so to speak, gave a decision in the presence of their master. And so too this idea that they were not married and did not have children refers to the fact that they also did not have those who received from them. They set themselves apart, as it were, from the community of Israel, not receiving from Moshe because they were on such a high level, and also not really being connected with the community of Israel, not giving over to students, to those that were dependent on them as well, because of the fact that they really were on such a high level. In a way, they denied their connection with all of Israel. And this actually is the very nature of the strange fire that they brought before Hashem. And this is why it was called a strange fire. Because they were on such a high level, they felt no connection to anyone, not to those above them in the level of Moshe, and not to those below them, the level of those who would be receiving from them, represented here in the statement by our sages of a wife and children. And this, in fact, was the nature of the Eish Zara, the strange fire that they brought before Hashem, and why the verse tells us that Hashem did not command them to bring that fire, because they were on their own. And that's exactly what is not commanded by God. The service which is desired by Hashem is that in which we are totally connected to the unit, to our master, each of us receiving, and to those who can receive from us. And thus it becomes part of an eternal community where we are serving God together and we are progressing spiritually together. And one of the deepest lessons of this opening verse of Acharei-Mot and the insight into the demise of Nadav and Avihu is the importance of community, the importance of every person, no matter what his level, to be attached to the entire body of Israel, and the importance of community in general in a life of Torah and serving God.